Your microphones will be muted during the webinar as we have a large number of people coming online. But we do encourage you to participate and submit questions and comments via the chat feature on Zoom. So please do use that feature, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the seminar. And the webinar is scheduled to last up to 5:30, so for 1 hour. So for those of you who haven't met before, my name is Craig McCoy. I'm the chair of London HR Connection, which is a role I've had for the last 8 years or so. I'm also a senior HR director with about 35 years experience now in the HR profession and a fellow of the CIPD. I've been an HR director, I think for 16 roles now and counting, both as a permanent employee and an interim across a number of sectors. I'm currently the interim HR director at St John Ambulance here in London. A few words about London HR Connection. We're a long-established professional networking group for all of those with an interest in the world of HR. We originally established in the 1980s, at origins within the CIPD, to whom we remain affiliated. But we have an independent board, which I chair, with 9 senior HR professionals. In normal time, we're well known for our live events. Obviously, the last couple of years, we've been solely webinar based. However, I'm very pleased to say we're reopening our doors for live events on May the 25th. And I'll be saying a few words about that at the end of the session. We are a not-for-profit organisation, and our model is based on commercial sponsorship. You can see on the slide in front of you the list of our current sponsors, including OECAM, our sponsors for today. So I'd now like to introduce our speaker panel, and our sponsors for this event are OECAM, and I'm very pleased to welcome Gary Ashton, his partner, and Julie Brophy, the principal consultant, both with extensive experience in the field of leadership and organisation development. And Gary and Julie are joined today by Jenny Heels, who's the Transformation Director for the BMJ, who many of you may know better as the British Medical Journal. All three will share their perspectives on how leadership mindset is shifting to adapt to a post-COVID world. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. So now, without any further ado, let me hand over to Gary. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Craig. So if you move on to the agenda, so as you can see, we'll talk first of all a bit about the context, the background to the Agile mindset. Then we'll go through each of the 4 dimensions, and then we will talk about the role of HR in this need nowadays to test, learn, and adapt. So if we go on to the next slide, just as a quick introduction to OECAM, where OECAM stands for Organisation Effectiveness Cambridge. We help develop individual, team, and organisational effectiveness across all sectors. And that, as you can see on the diagram on the right, requires the focus of both the hard and the soft elements of people development. So that's a bit about OECAM. Jenny, do you want to describe a bit about BMJ?
Yes, sure. So I'm Jenny Hills, Transformation Director at BMJ. Quite simply, BMJ is a global healthcare knowledge provider, and we've got a vision for a healthier world, and we share knowledge and expertise to improve healthcare outcomes. In a nutshell, that's what we do.
Great, thank you. So a bit of context first. Our research on the Agile mindset really emerged when we were getting to understand the success factors of firms across Europe that were succeeding in transforming themselves from the analog to the digital world. And what we found, though, is that this model has proven very valid for all organisations grappling now with this volatile, uncertain, ambiguous and complex world that we're all experiencing. And the theories at the moment are that this VUCA world is not going to go away anytime soon. And one of the reasons for this validity is that having an agile mindset means being comfortable with the ambiguity that exists in our world now, which is actually contrary to the brain's natural desire for certainty. And so therefore, the minds of leaders needs to adapt to this new situation. But before we explore the model in more detail, Given that we are in a VUCA world, we'd just like to hear from yourselves in the chat as to some of the challenges that you're facing in your worlds that could have an implication for the role of leaders. So if you could just put that into the chat, just see the kinds of things that you're grappling with at the moment.
Yeah.
It's trying to get the leaders to accept the world is changing and adapt the organization. Yes, that's now part of their role is important, you're right. And the hybrid world working, of course, is a new one that we've all been grappling with. Julie, can you see any there that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I was just looking at the culture change one and becoming comfortable with more uncertainty and change. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I talk about mindset, because it's about equipping leaders with this ability to be comfortable with uncertainty, and we'll talk about that in a bit more. But it's not about sort of leadership development now isn't about the kind of things that they do, but it's actually this mindset, you know, so that they can flex to all situations, because we don't know what's coming. I mean, the world is changing so quickly.
Yeah, adopting to a digital transformation mindset. Yes, that's although that started a few years ago for many organizations, that's still an ongoing challenge.
Yeah.
So yes, so quite a range of issues there. Rapid recruitment and structural changes and needing training, support and coaching to catch up with their needs. Yes, because things are changing continually now. And obviously that's going to be a challenge for leaders to embed people whilst you're also then continually changing the organization. Good. Okay. Well, thank you for that. As you can see, quite a range of issues that we're all grappling with. Just a quick definition on the mindset. Our definition of mindset is the established set of thoughts, attitudes, and beliefs that you hold. And regarding being agile, we've identified these 4 areas where the mindset of leaders we believe needs to develop in order to function effectively in this disruptive world that we're now living in. And you have to bear in mind that this model really is complementary to any leadership framework you might have, because, of course, mindset is a precursor to enabling behavior change that takes place. So, as you can see here, the 4 areas that we're going to explore in more detail are being ambidextrous, so delivering business as usual, but also disrupting that status quo that you've got. Second one is being constructively authentic. So that's bringing not only your best self, but recognizing you are also a leader of an organization. And those 2 things can be quite testing for leaders. Third area is having that external perspective and really reaching out to learn from what's happening outside your organization or even your sector. And then underpinning that, of course, is the art of continuous learning, always being curious in order to learn and grow. So those are the areas that we're going to look at, and we're going to have a look at the first one of being ambidextrous. So this is all about the, as it says, being really able to work with both the left hand and the right hand. So that's the creative and the mass productive. And that's when those 2 approaches can often be in tension with each other. And the art is to find the right balance. As we all know, if we've got a dominant hand, writing hand, it's always very awkward to use the other hand for writing. And that shows that it's not natural to be ambidextrous, and it can be awkward and it can be slow. So we've got to recognize that it can take time to build that skill, if you like, and that mindset of being ambidextrous. So let's look at what those dimensions of ambidexterity could include. And here are three that we focus on. The first one, well, the three there is thinking, deciding, and doing. So the first one about thinking is really dealing with and reconciling the short, medium, and long-term views of the world and the organization that you're in. Certainly my experience in the retail sector, which was very short-term focused, and everyone got the adrenaline kick in their daily job on that. It was a big challenge to not only do that, but also start building things for the longer term. The second area on deciding, and this is really getting that balance of making sure you're managing your emotion and when you're actually making decisions. So finding the right time to make decisions so that you are in balance. And the third area is about delivering business as usual, whilst also disrupting the very business that you're trying to maintain. What you often find is there are some leaders are really great at building teams, and there are other leaders who are great at disrupting and creating the new. Now more leaders have to do both. They have to enable their teams whilst all at the same time think about how they're going to re-engineer it. So these are three areas that you will all have a preference on each of those as to where you're balanced between the right and the left hand, if you like. And the issue is creating the time and the space to give yourself the ability to get balance in each of these. So one example of that, I just want to check in with you all now, is on the time dimension, but not only the time, but the internal and external. So as you can see here, and organizations and yourself have this challenge of not only looking internally within the organization, but looking outside, looking to the past and finding out what's happened in terms of your performance, but also looking to the future. And ideally, you need to get a balance between all four quartiles here. And that's a challenge in itself. So again, in the chat, if you can just put, where do you think your organization needs to spend more time in each of those quartiles? Which is the quartile that you think you're not spending enough time focusing in on? So if you just put that in the chat, we'll just be able to see whether there's any commonality or whether there's a difference. So they're all to the future at the moment. There's one past internal. That's interesting. Yes. So there's definite bias towards the future. There's a couple of past internals there. But yes, it's more to do with being future focused, if I'm generalizing. Although, as MO has said, bottom left in capital letters there. Oh, and there's some more past internals coming in as we speak, but only because of a sense of romance about the past, not remembering reality. That's true, yes, the good old days. That's a good way to describe it. But as you know, it's easy to now identify, which here I'm generalizing, it's about the future. There's probably a bit more external future there that people need to focus on. The challenge then is to create the time and space to actually do that and have the attitude of mind to know that is as important as looking at the near term and the present. So that's the challenge that's all about ambidexterity. I'm going to ask now Jenny to just articulate how BMJ has been dealing with ambidexterity, or how it's manifested within your organisation. Jenny.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking very much about our experience through the recent pandemic, and obviously trying to give some examples of how we were operating ambidextrously, although I'm not sure we would necessarily have called it that at the time. So when the world turned upside down and inside out, where were we at in terms of our thinking? So certainly for the short term thinking, I'm sure it's the same story for most people. It was all about meeting the immediate needs flipping the business to fully remote. You know, we were living BCP in real time. So we had a small SWAT team set up who were focused on the dynamic, really short-term needs of the business as the pandemic unfolded. So practical things such as getting the kit out to people in their homes, much bigger things, identifying, understanding critical process gaps and mitigations. A key one for us was getting a weekly print journal to press, which had never missed a publication through 2 world wars and the 7/7 bombings. But it had never been done without everybody in the physical room on press day. You'll be pleased to know that we did it. And in fact, that weekly print team still choose to work fully remotely. So we're also considering everything else that wraps around that in the short term, adapting and defining our existing policies, quickly coming up with new approaches, trying to think about how we were supporting our staff's well-being. Like many people, we had staff at home increasingly juggling multiple aspects of their lives, with kids homeschooling, the whole family sharing the internet. And because we are a medical publisher, we were seeing unprecedented volumes of content that we were trying to get out to the healthcare community. So we were trying to manage an effective communication channel with all our teams in the UK and overseas. So that was almost on a daily basis, and we didn't really know how long this short-term response would be. In fact, it was nearly 2 years. Thinking more about the medium term, we recognised, I think, quite early on that we were going to have to take an initiative and start to plan for new ways of working post-pandemic. So as early as beginning of June 2020, we really kicked this off. So thinking about that, probably that future external focus. Just before the pandemic had hit, we'd undertaken a very extensive piece of staff engagement around our approach to flexible working, which had been developing and growing as it has for most businesses for many years. But it was obvious to us quite quickly that having flipped so successfully actually to fully remote, that this would really accelerate us on that path. So again, we quickly launched a project. We brought representatives in from across the business. We took a very grassroots up approach to figure out how this could work for us as individuals, as teams, and at the organisational level. At this stage, we were very much keeping this thread of work around the future state completely separate from our pandemic response planning. We were still thinking about getting back to the office in COVID secure working. You know, we still believe that there would be an end to the pandemic, you know, by Easter, by the summer, by Christmas. And so, as well as our internally focused project, we also started to do that external engagement. We got ourselves into quite a lot of forums externally, you know, industry-based HR groups. There were lots of webinars going on. We connected with similar organisations and partners who we'd worked with before, across our sector and across the Knowledge Quarter where our offices are based. And we gathered a lot of data. We also partnered quite quickly with an external space planning consultancy. They had quite a lot of existing knowledge about new ways of working, and also were picking up a lot of feedback as the situation developed. So thinking more about the longer term thinking, in the longer term, we realised that we couldn't keep the two things separate. We had to bring things together. So, you know, being agile in our thinking, we had to bring it all together. Our separate threads of pandemic response and our longer term plans for new ways of working. And this really started to culminate in a longer term view of how we would completely reshape our thinking about how, where and when we worked. And what we now call smart working was born. And with the principles of working, we launched a very ambitious programme to totally remodel and reinvent our very, very traditional old-fashioned office space. And we reduced our footprint by a third, or by 2/3 actually, down to 1/3, and created a totally new, exciting and very different collaborative space that we would be bringing people back into when we did get back into face-to-face working. Thinking about deciding, in designing the new smart working, we engaged from the bottom up. We gathered an enormous amount of data from across our full global employment base. So that was through extensive and very detailed staff survey, which we had tremendously high engagement for, which probably wasn't that surprising because we were in lockdown after all, no one had anything else to do. But this was really, really helpful and rich data for us that we then blended with extensive one-to-one interviews, focus groups, all of this obviously done fully remotely, to help us gather that more emotionally led input into our plans. Brought this all together into a proposal for a whole new set of principles and practices around how we were going to work, alongside a very large capital refurbishment investment project. Got that in front of our exec team and board, which were approved. And then we did a lot of consultation with a transition engagement group, which included union representatives, leads from our EDI network groups. And then we built that all into a very comprehensive launch plan, which of course we then redrafted about 15 times and amended as the ever-changing demands of the pandemic, with new variants emerging and new waves washing over us. And thinking about the doing, meanwhile, the business continued to run in the fully remote world. We were literally creating masses of new content, most of it COVID related. We had to adapt our existing products. We have a huge international forums. We have 2 or 3 a year, which attract literally thousands of delegates, and they had to go virtual. And we had to run all of our other usual business processes, such as recruiting and onboarding staff, and that included a new CEO and CTO, both on recruited and onboarded during lockdown, whilst operating, as I mentioned before, the previously seemingly impossible business processes remotely from our homes.
Thanks, Jenny. So we've sort of covered being ambidextrous. One of the other things that our research showed is this constructive authenticity. And it's a kind of move on from authenticity and acknowledging that we need to be authentic, but we also need to acknowledge that we have pressure put on us from our role and from our organization, because we are required to be leaders. There are things that we need to do as leaders that we might not necessarily want to do, but we actually need to because of our position. And we also need to function within the culture and the values of our organization. So constructive authenticity is really about bringing the best of yourself to the job that's right for you and for the organization and for your role. And obviously, the more those overlap, the more comfortable you are in bringing that authentic, your best self to work. One of the things it's not around constructive authenticity is actually an excuse to behave or act ineffectively and without consideration of others. We, don't necessarily see that, but we were talking with a leadership, and he said, well, I'm just a grumpy old curmudgeon. And we were saying, well, that's not really going to work in a leadership role. So yes, you don't have to be brightness and sunshine, but you do need to accept that you need to interact with people and work with them. So we talk about constructive authenticity than just authenticity, because we're acknowledging those other requirements that put on us around leadership and organization. And there's a balance to be achieved in authenticity, because if you think about one end, we can be totally honest and say, actually, I just don't agree with what the decision is that's being made by the organization. And, I'm going to say that, and I'm a leader and I'm out there and I'm being totally honest with you. Well, actually, that's not really going to be very useful for the organization or for the team, because, there may be things the organization needs to happen which you're not supporting. And also for your team, if you're saying, actually, I just don't believe this, well, where do we go? What do we do? So that's one end of the continuum. On the other end of the continuum, there's basically lying, which, I think that decision is great. I'm really behind it. I'm totally with it. I think we should all get behind it. And the number of things is that the fact that you don't believe it will leak out either in your behavior or some of your language. And also from a personal perspective, it's very uncomfortable, I think, over time to actually support something you really don't and don't acknowledge that you have concerns. So with constructive authenticity, there's a nice middle ground, which is saying, actually, I have reservations, but the decision has been taken. So now let's think about the best way to do it. So you are acknowledging that you have concerns, but it's not, you're also considering your role as a leader and as the organization. And in this particular instance, it's actually those that have a bit more claim on to your authentic self. So there's this nice middle ground. And for leaders to really be constructively authentic, they need 3 things. So one is actually kind of humility, but with confidence. In a VUCA world, we can't know everything. I mean, the world is just complex. There's so much information flowing about that actually what we need to do is say, there are things I don't know, and I want to, you know, have your opinions. What do you think? How can you help? And it's about bringing your team together and using the strengths of everybody, but it's with confidence. What you don't want to do is there's a story in the Harvard Business Review about a leader who basically had humility, but basically had said things like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. You know, what do you think? Because I don't understand this. And because there was humility, but without confidence, they lost credibility. So that's not what we want to do as leaders. It's about this ambidexterity. It's about having humility, but having confidence. They also need to be able to make an environment of psychological safety, so people do feel that they can bring their most authentic self to work and have that authenticity, constructive authenticity. And as leaders, we have responsibility to not only role model it, but also create that environment for others so they can do it. And leaders also need emotional intelligence, and that's about understanding themselves and their limitation. So links very much with the humility with confidence, but it's also about having that external perspective again. It's about looking and seeing how others are doing and being aware of other people, but also being organizationally aware. So how is the organization doing? What does that requirement? So together, those three elements give the leader the opportunity to really be constructively authentic. So now Jenny's going to share some of her experience in BMJ.
Yeah, so really sort of focusing on those three elements of humility, psychological safety, emotional intelligence, and again, you know, thinking about how we were working over that sort of 2-year period. I think humility was something that we did demonstrate from a leadership level, and that was really from the top down, from our CEO down, and it was a new CEO as well, so it was a kind of a big thing for him. But from the outset, we tried to be really clear in all of our messaging as we were developing the smart working processes and thinking about our response to the pandemic, that this was an iterative process, that we didn't have all the answers, that there were many unknowns, and that we could probably get things wrong, and we probably would, but that we were prepared to change, to step back if necessary, to let processes evolve as things became more certain. And I'm not even sure that things are that much more certain now, but we're getting there. But what we tried to do in all of our messaging was be decisive, to respond to the questions that were coming in, but acknowledge that we didn't have everything. You know, we couldn't give people firm answers, and we would listen and evolve as we went along. And in terms of psychological safety, for our managers and for our project teams and for our staff, we built in really strong feedback loops. We created a variety of forums. We used pulse surveys, town halls, team meetings, management group briefing groups, and continued to consult throughout the process. One thing we really resisted, even though we were often being really asked for this, was to issue hard and fast new policies. We shied away from constructing boundaries that were really firm and fixed, because it can be even more unsettling when we have to move them. And we gave ourselves and our people the permission to be flexible, to get comfortable, to try and, if necessary, fail. And we're still doing that now, to be frank. It's still an evolving process. For our managers, particularly, giving them that sort of support that they needed, we engaged with OECAM actually, and we set up a series of workshops that were aimed at really identifying what those shared concerns and issues were. We put ourselves through a hybrid simulator to try and help us prepare for and think about a totally different approach to how we work and how we were going to manage our teams. I mean, people were really quite concerned about potential conflicts. What this did really, I think, shine a light on was the fact that it helped us all to recognise that through that really intense period, you know, we all had very deeply personal experiences and had really formed our own preferences that made us feel safe about how we wanted to work and where we wanted to be, and that we really needed to step back. We, as leaders and managers, needed to see that wider perspective, think about what was needed across our teams and the wider business, but at the same time giving managers frameworks to support consistency. I think we all saw that one outcome of that very introverted, fully remote working is that we'd all become a bit self-centered, and might even say a bit self-obsessed. And we as managers needed to broaden our views and our perspectives.
Great, thank you, Jenny. So moving on to the third area, which is having an external perspective, being passionate about changes in the world and its implications for the organisation. It was a good hook with what you, or segue there, Jenny, with that sort of self-centeredness that was starting to happen for individuals because they were at home during the pandemic. That really, the last 2 years, there's been a general inward-looking attitude, if you like, for people and leaders, and focused on survival and on staff welfare, of course. But to evolve and thrive, there is a need to establish this habit of always looking outside of the organisation and even outside of the sector into related worlds to learn from them. We run innovation safaris, for example, which is to look at other sectors, but related in terms of activities for organisations, so that they can extrapolate from what's happening somewhere else and say, well, how could that benefit us? So there are ways of doing that. But why is it important to have an external perspective? Well, I don't know whether anyone knows what this product is. So anyone in the chat function who can quickly type in if you ever bought this product. BlackBerry, no, not quite. BlackBerry was actually a good one, wasn't it? Yeah, no, it isn't BlackBerry. It's actually Twitter Peak. So it was a device that Twitter came up with to send and receive tweets. So it was entirely dedicated for that Twitter service. I'm sure Elon Musk would have something to say about that if he ever gets his hands on them. But it was really a great tech idea, if you like, that was very product centered. And what they hadn't really done was really think about, well, what does the customer want? What does the customer need? Because the customer certainly didn't need this. Compare that to more general, bigger service, if you like, in terms of Netflix, where they have continually evolved and disrupted themselves over the time. They started posting DVDs, as we know, to then going online DVDs, then to producing movies, and now being that internet entertainment platform that they create. And what they've focused on is, as they describe, the customer obsession, which is more than just customer focus, because it's really to deliver on unanticipated future needs, to really get ahead of the curve. And in order to do that, what they've recognized equally is it's their people that obviously is the source of all of this. So to bring in the right people with the right attitudes and create the right environment so that it can continually disrupt itself is the challenge. So it's something that can be done. It's something that's easily forgotten to maintain that external perspective. So now we'll move on back to BMJ and hear Jenny, what kind of things have BMJ done to keep that external view of the world?
So I think obviously we're a medical publisher, and so during a situation like the pandemic, we were immediately focused on our external audience. In line with many other medical publishers and knowledge providers, we immediately launched a free-to-access portal, brought together all of our COVID-related research articles, learning, clinical decision support material. Our article throughput across our journals rose massively, and for our teams in editorial and production processes, and I manage those teams, they were working around the clock to review and publish critical research. Some areas our volumes rose by up to 1,000%. It was very tricky because we're trying to maintain that balance between satisfying the demand and also maintaining a balance and well-being for our staff. So that was a really difficult one for us to grapple with. But there is, I think, a real passion across our business for our vision of a healthier world. And actually, I think that external, outward-looking view for us really helped teams to remain focused in what was actually a pretty difficult and frightening situation. But we are a commercial company, and a result of this external focus, our online traffic rose to unprecedented levels, and our reach and readership without doubt has increased as a result. And the rising visibility of our company, I'm sure many of you may have seen our editor-in-chief, or she's actually retired since then, but Dr. Fiona Godley was on news programmes around the world and quite the poster girl for CNN at one point. and our online advertising revenues soared as a result of some of this unexpected activity. But thinking about how we bring an external perspective into BMJ, we did have a new CEO who joined us during lockdown, and one of the things that he's really got us thinking a lot more about is how we broaden our external perspectives. And as an executive team, we meet on a regular basis, and we have regular external speakers, not just on specific things that we're currently focused on, but from adjacent or related areas of interest, who come in, they present, they join our conversations. And that's been a really interesting thing that we are continuing to do at all of our regular exec meetings, and actually featured heavily at our board strategy planning last year and will again this year.
Thanks, Jenny. So the final one of the Agile mindset from our research is basically around continuous learning. As Gary said right at the beginning, we have this very complex VUCA world. So what we don't want is our leaders to stagnate. We really want them to continue to understand what's happening and learn. And this work, I mean, a lot of people know this work from covered work, and it's around the fixed and the growth mindset. And the growth mindset doesn't say we're all going to be constant pianists, but what it does say, it's about having an internal belief that we can all improve our abilities if we develop it. And some of the research she's done, especially sort of in 2017, was very interesting, because she said that growth mindset it's not just about that kind of curiosity, but it's also about things like how we evaluate situations and how much effort we'll put in and how we respond to feedback. So growth mindset actually has a lot of things are wrapped up to it, just not about that attitude towards growth. And also, I mean, one of the things is that growth mindset, the kind of continuous learning growth mindset, needs not just an internal, but an external input. So if we're thinking back to when we were talking about constructive authenticity, when we were talking about, you know, that accepting that we don't know everything, but reaching out to people, but also having that emotional intelligence to say, I understand this and I'm fine with this, but actually this is an area where I can develop, and being open to that and taking those external sources to help our own development. But also we all have our own blind spots. So getting third-party feedback that actually says, well, yeah, Julie, you're great at this, but actually this is somewhere where you can improve, and being open to that kind of feedback is part of this whole continuous learning activity, which is very key for leaders. Otherwise, we don't have an agile mindset, because we are basically stuck in our thinking. So Jenny's just going to talk about what they've been doing about emerging curiosity and things.
Yeah, so just not a huge amount to say really, other than I think that we really did get into that agile thinking and iterating process through it, and the acceptance that we need to try and often to fail in order to learn and progress, and that really remains firmly in place with us at BMJ. We've got a cohort of innovation champions, and they recently ran a really good program on the art of failure, and that involved interviewing leaders from across the business who really bravely shared some experiences, in some cases of quite epic failures, and that included our new CEO, and you know, focused on what they learned from that and how that developed them as individuals and their future success. Obviously, throughout the whole pandemic, we continued to deliver training. We actually really accelerated some of our EDI program and input to our D&I networks, and you know, we carried on with our normal annual performance review processes in a remote setting. And this is kind of really coming through into our this continuing learning concept into our new emerging culture. So just sort of, you know, the last thing to say is one of our new stated behaviours is that we are curious, we take inspiration from the world around us, and we aren't afraid to experiment with new ways of doing things. And I think to have that as a stated behaviour in our culture statement really kind of embodies the sort of the programme that we've been through over the past couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. We've introduced you to the four, given you a sort of brief summary of the four areas of research it shows us. Just before we start talking about the role of HR and how that, you know, how you can bring agile mindset into your organization, we just wanted to see what you think your leaders need? Where do they need to be better equipped? So we're going to put up a quick poll, and you can actually respond to more than one area. So if you think actually they need to be more constructively authentic or do more continuous learning, you can actually tick more than one box. So Denise is just going to launch the poll for us. Thank you. I think at the moment it's looking fairly even between being ambidextrous and constructive authenticity. Oh, no, constructive authenticity is slightly winning at the moment. Okay, numbers are slowing down a little bit, so we'll just give it another few seconds. Okay, Denise, if you just want to end the poll and then share it, that'd be great. Thank you. So you can see there that we've got being or ambidextrous and constructive authenticity are probably areas where you're saying that the leadership is slightly more in need and then continuous learning external perspective. And I think one of the important things, I think, when we've been working with people, as Gary said, is some of this can be quite uncomfortable because we do have preferences. So, you know, it is about giving people time and space to practice these activities, as well as actually sort of educating them in the kind of tools and techniques they have. So there's no one that sort of stands out, but maybe that little bit of external perspective. So maybe actually a lot of the leaders have, you know, more practiced in getting out there, so they're more comfortable with it. But that's interesting. Thank you very much. We'll stop sharing that. Okay, and Gary will just recap.
Yes, so I won't go through the 4 again. It's just to remind ourselves that this is about getting ourselves, because it's something that we all need to continually learn, getting our minds around these 4 areas, and it's a precursor to behavior change. So it's kind of complementary to any leadership development program that you have. And what's required really is about building the understanding of why this kind of mindset's required in the world that we're in. I think someone commented on that earlier in the chat. And also provide opportunities for leaders to develop their skills in these 4 areas as well. So Julie's just going to go through some examples of where HR can work with the organisation.
Yeah, I think one of the key things for us, and I think probably for you, is that this is facilitated by HR. It's not owned by HR. It's about the business and the leaders owning this agile mindset. But the kinds of things that HR can do, and this is certainly one of the things we did when we worked with Jenny, was we actually created use cases around things like the hybrid working and being more agile that really relate to them, and putting them into different situations, but putting them in there outside of the working environment. So as Jen was talking about with the simulator, we actually took people out of the environment, but we built in real cases about how are you going to respond to this? How is this going to impact on you? How can we deal with this? What kind of skills do you need? And what kind of thinking do you need? And also from an HR perspective, it's actually working with leaders to find opportunities to practice this. Just going back to that point Gary made, if we have a preference, working in the other way can get very uncomfortable. So we need to be able to practice it. If any of you ever tried writing with your right hand and your left hand, and then broken your right hand and you have to use your left hand, practice makes you better, which also goes back to the continuous learning piece. We can get better. So we need to be able to provide them with places to practice. I'm just going to pull out a couple of others. So one is about aligning the silent communicators. So that is the processes that we have in our organization. You know, if we're talking about agile, having agile mindset leaders, do we recruit in that way? Do we test when we bring in people into the organization? How do we reward that? So what are the silent communicators that we have within the organization that can support or actually inhibit being a leader with an agile mindset? And I think the other thing as well is, from an HR perspective, is we have the opportunity to be role models, to go out there, do continuous learning, to be constructively authentic, to be ambidextrous, and to take in external perspective. So I think HR has a lot of roles that it can play, but I don't think it's about HR owning this for an organisation, because it has to be embedded in the whole organisation for you to really benefit from that agile mindset that you can develop in your leaders. So that's in the input. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi everyone, and please do put your questions in the chat, and we will we'll pick those up before we close. But just to get things going for the panel, I mean, one of the interesting things for me is, to what extent do you think the pandemic has been formative in shifting the whole concept and practice of leadership? Obviously, it's been a couple of years now since lockdown started. Or do you think that in any case leadership concepts were shifting and we would have got to the same place anyway? Or what do you think has been the specific impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, from my perspective, it was as if some ideas had been formed that weren't really being looked at seriously enough before the pandemic. The pandemic just forced it into everybody's face to realise that that things need to change. And so some of the techniques or some of the requirements of leaders was already there, but the pandemic has forced people to say, yes, these are absolutely necessary now. So I think it's accelerated the need and made more people realise the need for it.
Yeah, and thank you. Kelly's put in the chat that things like hybrid working have definitely been accelerated and people having to think outside the box. I think that's probably true, isn't it? I mean, there was a lot of talk about taking time to introduce flexible work patterns and home working and so on, and suddenly everybody had to do it. So it was kind of like the whole kind of leadership model shifted overnight, didn't it?
Mm.
I think that's something you experienced, didn't you, Jenny? It was almost like, oh, the next day you had to change the way you led.
Yeah, it was rocket fuel, really. You know, I think I mentioned that we'd been looking at our flexible working approach, and it's a conversation that's been going on for years, and it just jet propelled that and took it to places we never thought it would go to. Yeah, definitely a big accelerator, and quite, you know, it's taken quite a lot to get people feeling comfortable that they can make decisions, and if you like, giving people permission to be that flexible has been something that I think a lot of leaders in BMJ have struggled with. But actually, 2.5 years in, I think we're starting to see that people getting more comfortable with those concepts.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think it's also brought to the forefront is a little bit more about the emotional intelligence of leaders, that actually if you're trying to work remotely and you need to keep in touch with your teams, but also checking in how they're doing and actually being much more aware of how they're feeling and everything, because you don't get the normal signals you do when you're in the room together. So I think that sort of acknowledgement that emotional intelligence is a leadership skill has also increased since hybrid, since the lockdown.
There's a question. Yeah. Oh, Craig, yeah, sorry,
Gary. Yeah, I was just going to say there's a follow-up question here, which is about sustaining hybrid working. This question from Judy. Now that we don't have to work from home, everyone could come back to the office. Yeah, how are organisations coping with that?
Well, it's funny how, I mean, at both ends of the spectrum, organisations that said you must come in are realising that that's not actually working, and they've modified their statements. Those that said what I call sort of the Martini approach of you can work anytime, any place, anywhere, they've rode back on that as well. I think actually people are entering a middle ground because it's put the onus on the employee, if you like. They've got the power, more of the power. And so although technically everyone can come back, there is a buyer's market and people can look elsewhere if they're not particularly keen on coming into the office every day. So the reality is, I think there will be a degree of hybrid working. It'll differ by sector, it'll be differ by function, but it will be there more so than it was before.
Just to chip in on that from our perspective as well, because we've got, you know, we've taken a really fully flexible approach. not quite the martini approach, but not too far away from that. And I think there's lots of things that you need to think about. There are some things, so for example, our town halls work really well in a remote setting. It's a much better playing field for everyone. So we will always do those kinds of large broadcast meetings as virtual meetings. So even if you're in the office, you sit at a desk and you join virtually, it makes it a much better experience for everybody. We've kind of set our stall out as we come together for purpose. So trying to understand what the opportunities are when actually there is a genuine reason why being face-to-face works better. But even in those situations, making sure that we've got the right technologies wherever we can have to support hybrid, because certainly at the moment, often people want to come together, but then they go and get COVID and they can't. So there's a lot of things to think about, from really practical stuff like having, we spent a lot of money investing in better technologies to connect people better in that hybrid world, if they're in the office or if they're at home. So there's lots to think about, but as you say, Gary, it's a buyer's market. But on the other side, our pool for resources and talent has now got so much wider. You know, I've got a brand new Salesforce platforms developer starting in Sheffield. It really doesn't matter. You know, if we were competing for that resource in London, it would have been a different story. So there's many upsides as well.
That's very true, isn't it? And we had a question from Ella, which is about multinational organisations. So internationally, do you see these dimensions varying in terms of the degree to which they're accepted and practiced?
No, I don't think we do. I mean, we're working with an organisation at the moment, which is a global organisation, and working around these principles as well. And I don't think it is. I think it's about, it might be applied differently in parts of organisations. Because obviously there are differences in sort of the authentic, constructive authenticity, because there are certain cultures that might have more demands on you when you work for an organisation. But it's about adjusting. But I don't think it has. I mean, we haven't seen anything with this global organisation that would say that the 4 areas need to be different. They need to be flexed a little bit for locally. But no, I'm not seeing anything differently. But also, we're also seeing acceptance that we need to be more agile, that everybody is in the VUCA world now. I mean, that's probably one of the things the pandemic has done, is it's shown everybody the complexity of what the world is doing, and things like the supply chain and how we're all interconnected. So no, I think in a global organisation, we haven't really seen that.
No, that's good. I think that also probably answers Lee's question, or a similar question. Would you prioritise any of the 4 dimensions when you're looking to embed Agile in an organisation? I think you've probably answered that in the context of international organisations. We did have a question regarding giving leaders time to practice, Julie. Any practical examples of how this practice could happen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're doing with a different organisation is we're doing this at the moment with them, is we've actually, as part of support for the learning of the tools and the techniques and the thinking and practicing the approach, is they're actually all working on a case study. So they've all got projects which have been assigned by the company. So they are projects which will deliver something for the business, but they're being used really as a sort of practice site. So they're giving a bit more space in the organisation, and they're writing case studies. So they're doing things like, as they prepare to go into the case study or into the project, they're thinking about how they're using these skills. How am I thinking about the external perspective, and how am I bringing this into the project? And it really is just reinforcing their learning. So it gives them an opportunity. So we've gone through these techniques in a sort of safe space, and now they're applying it in the real world. But what it also shows is a great commitment from the leadership to give them this space. And at the end of their projects, with their case studies, they're actually going to go back and talk to the leadership about how it made them think differently, how they've become more agile and everything. So it can be a commitment from the organisation, but none of these projects have been made up. They are projects that the organisation have done, but they've been given the space to use these techniques to deliver these projects as well.
Very good. Thank you. And we had a question from Pash, which is about collaboration. And I guess the point that she's making is that collaboration is a vital part of Agile working. Now, I guess collaboration can be challenging, particularly people are working in a hybrid fashion. So any examples of where collaboration, you've seen that working particularly well?
Well, it's more like it's different from company to company in that it's really a balance between accountability for delivering things and collaborating and delivering things through collaboration. So what we find is some firms are high on the collaboration front, but aren't actually delivering things. Others are high on the delivery front, achieving results, but aren't collaborating. So for us, it's about getting that balance that you collaborate appropriately and sufficiently enough to deliver on the required objectives. And it's getting everyone to have a mature attitude towards collaboration. So don't do it for its own sake, because then you can get, in some firms you see, they over collaborate and then things slow down and get more complicated.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So thank you. I think we're getting to the end of the questions online. So unless anyone, any closing comments from the speakers?
No. I think we will just say, sorry, I was just going to say that there's more information, and we have a white paper that we've been downloaded where it has a lot of the research that we've been talking about. So if people are interested in that, then that's available on our OECAM page.
Very good. Thank you. So, okay, so just in terms of closing, can I give a big thank you to all three speakers today. So Gary, Julie and Jenny covered a lot in the space of an hour. And I can see some great feedback coming up in the chat as well. So I think that's been really appreciated in terms of the insights that you've shared today. And I guess you'd be happy for all of our participants to contact you directly afterwards and follow up if they have any questions or any further conversations that they wish to have. So thank you very much, and I found that really very interesting. Now, so before we close, I just wanted to mention our next event. So I'm very pleased to say that after 2 years of absence, we're reopening our door to live events. Our first event is taking place starting at 6:15 on May the 25th. It's at the Novotel Hotel on London Bridge. So I'm looking forward to saying this. Join us for a glass of wine or two, some canapes, and obviously some great speakers. We have a fantastic speaker as well. We have the Chief Executive of Wagamama. I'm sure all familiar with Wagamama, who's one of the rare breed of CEOs who was previously an HR director. So it can be done. He's joined by Doug Hewitt, who's a partner at People Made, which is a brand and culture consultancy. So that should be a great event. And you'll see that we'll continue with a mixture of both live events and webinars now as we get back into the new normal moving forward for London HR Connection. So that's it for now. So the recording will be available for this event very shortly. And I hope to see you at our next event. But until then, bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.